All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us again today. I'm Jen Schonger from the New Jersey Autism Center of Excellence, the NJACE, which is funded in part by the New Jersey Governor's Council and the New Jersey Department of Health. I'm so excited to be here today with Professor Morton Gernsbacher. Before I introduce her, just to go over our usual housekeeping notes, we are live on YouTube right now, and the recording will be available to watch at any time after. We will have both Spanish and English captions as well as a transcript. And we encourage you to ask questions or comment. You just need to be logged into your YouTube account, and you may need to subscribe to our page, which you'll want to do anyway, so you don't miss any alerts from us. And as always, we love to hear more about you. So if you're comfortable, please feel free to let us know a little about yourself in the chat. Today, Professor Gernsbacher is going to present, and then we'll get to all of the questions at the end. But please feel free to ask them as you have them, if that's easiest for you. So now I am happy to introduce Professor Morton Gernsbacher, an award-winning teacher whose open access active learning undergraduate courses were deemed APA's 2018 Outstanding Educational Resource. In 1998, Dr. Gernsbacher received the Hilldale Award for Distinguished Professional Accomplishment, the highest award bestowed by the University of Wisconsin Madison faculty. She served as editor-in-chief of the journal Memory and Cognition, co-editor of Psychological Science in the Public Interest, associate editor of Cognitive Psychology, and 9 other editorial boards. She's delivered the William James Lecture, the Norman Anderson Distinguished Lecture, the Psy-Chi Distinguished Lecture, the Cascade Distinguished Lecture, the Ricciuti Lecture, I apologize if I mispronounced that, the John Kendall Lecture, the Fern Foreman Fisher Lecture, and the APA Distinguished Scientist Lecture, and was the inaugural Lufkin Honorary Lecturer and the inaugural Evan L. Brown Memorial Lecturer. For nearly 40 years, Dr. Gernsbacher research has investigated the cognitive and neural mechanisms that underlie human communication. Her research bears both basic science implications and national policy applications. She's published nearly 200 journal articles and invited chapters. She's authored or edited 10 books, and her research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, Department of Defense, the Centers for Disease Control, and several foundations. Welcome, Dr. Gernsbacher.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be joining you today to discuss one of my favorite topics, questioning who lacks reciprocity by challenging some precarious assumptions about autistic people. For today's event, I was asked to talk about my autism research, which I'm thrilled to do. However, I should be clear that my autism-related research is only one component of my research portfolio, which includes basic memory research that I began back during my master's program. And I've conducted basic attention research, particularly in the realm of attentional suppression and inhibition. But perhaps I'm best known for my language comprehension research, including my first book titled Language Comprehension as Structure Building. I found my way to autism research nearly 20 years ago when a close family member was diagnosed as autistic. And one of my earliest publications in this area, perhaps only my 10th autism related publication, set in motion my approach to autism research. That article, titled Toward a Behavior of Reciprocity, published in 2006, questioned the core assumption that autistic people are impaired in reciprocity. In that older article, I reminded readers and myself that reciprocity is by definition a bilateral phenomenon. One dictionary defines reciprocity as, quote, a relation of mutual dependence or action or influence, unquote, as exemplified by the classic reciprocal promise, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Another dictionary definition of reciprocity specifies that reciprocity is, quote, a mode of exchange in which transactions take place between individuals who are symmetrically placed. That is, they're exchanging as equals, neither being in a dominant position, unquote. But when I read the scholarly literature and when I listened to researchers and some clinicians and even some parents talk about autism and reciprocity, it seemed they forgot that reciprocity is bilateral, that it's a relation of mutual dependence, that it occurs between individuals who are symmetrically placed, who are equals, with neither being in a dominant position. For example, what was initially called the social reciprocity scale, published in 2002, contained items inquiring as to whether the autistic child is regarded by other children as odd or weird. Now, to me, it seemed that this item measures the lack of other children's social or emotional reciprocity, not the lack of the autistic child's social or emotional reciprocity. Regarding an autistic child as odd or weird implicates the regarder, not the autistic child, as lacking in reciprocity, as does the item inquiring whether the autistic child gets teased a lot. How in the world the occurrence of an autistic child getting teased could be construed as a metric that the autistic child, rather than the child who teases them, lacks social or emotional reciprocity truly baffled me. And that, along with numerous other examples, was the purpose of my article titled Toward a Behavior of Reciprocity. I wanted to remind researchers, clinicians, parents, and everyone that reciprocity is a two-way street. Similarly, my article asking, does the autistic brain lack core modules, published in 2005, also challenged widely held assumptions. In this case, the assumption that autistic people lack core brain systems, systems that many researchers have stated makes humans human. That's right. Researchers have claimed that autistic people lack neural systems that are uniquely human. How would you like to be described that way? I know I wouldn't like to be described that way. And do you think the researchers who have described autistic people as lacking basic core features that make humans human have thought about how autistic people might feel to be described that way? If not, perhaps it's those researchers who are the ones who lack reciprocity. Just a thought. In 2005, I also published in the journal Science an empirical review of numerous studies demonstrating that autistic children do not have deficits in forming attachments with their primary caregivers. Those who claim that autistic people lack social and emotional reciprocity often bank on the assumption that autistic children have abnormal social and emotional connections or attachment to their primary caregivers, but that assumption is demonstratively and empirically false. In 2006 and 2007, I had the honor of serving as president of the 25,000 member Association of Psychological Science. And I used that opportunity to display these ideas to an even broader audience. In one of my APS presidential columns titled On Not Being Human, I challenged those researchers who had made those claims that autistic children and adults lack mechanisms that were claimed to be uniquely human. And some of those researchers were really big names in my field of psychology, like really big names. In another of my APS presidential columns, this one titled How to Spot Bias in Research, I called attention to the bias autism researchers can hold when they interpret their results. In another APS presidential column titled Reaching for Relevance, I encouraged all researchers to refrain from reaching too far in claiming that their results are relevant to autism. In my column titled Eye of the Beholder, which harkened back to my favorite episode of The Twilight Zone, and if you have a chance, look up that episode because I think it's extraordinary. I saw it when I was an 8-year-old and I've thought about it ever since. In that column, I demonstrated how if the world was predominantly autistic, it would be the non-autistic people who would be considered odd and weird, who'd get teased, and who would most likely be diagnosed as being disordered. In neural diversity, I encouraged researchers to respect differences as diversity, even when those differences are neural or brain differences. And this APS presidential column brought me a brush with pop culture fame. In the column, I had riffed about behavioral diversity, such as people who load the silverware with the in the dishwasher with the handles up versus the handles down, or people who in the shower wash their body first and then wash their hair versus those who wash their hair first and then their body, and people who place toilet paper on its rod with the free end on top versus those who place it with the free end of the toilet paper on the bottom. And folks, those observations are what earned me a place in Wikipedia in the prestigious article titled Toilet Paper Orientation. Lastly, and more importantly, in my column titled The True Meaning of Research Participation, I shared how enriched my research program became when I began including autistic people, not just as research subjects, but as true collaborators who generate the ideas for my studies, as exemplified by 3 articles, one titled Autism, Common, Heritable, but Not Harmful, another titled Learning in Autism, and another titled The Level and Nature of Autistic Intelligence, all of which I published with Michelle Dawson, including 2 articles for which Michelle, who is an incredibly smart and talented autistic Canadian about my age, served as first author. To me, that's the true meaning of research participation. My collaboration with Namira Akhtar, who's Muslim and who appreciates a culture in which eye contact can be considered impolite and even unholy, led to 2 papers challenging the altar on which eye contact is deified in Western societies and even more gloriously deified in autism treatment and research. And these articles led to my writing a paper in the journal Nature titled Autism Without Borders, in which I challenged Western-centric autism researchers and practitioners to work beyond our cultural biases. In a chapter titled A Conspicuous Absence of Scientific Leadership, the Illusory Epidemic of Autism, published in a book titled Leadership and Discovery, which included other authors such as astronauts and Nobel physicists, I recounted how much resistance I had met years earlier when I published an article titled 3 Reasons Not to Believe in an Autism Epidemic. I'm still stumped how well-known autism researchers who knew that, for example, vaccines didn't cause autism, didn't speak out at the time. On the other hand, my earlier article challenging the assumption of an autism epidemic had led to my receiving death threats and other antagonisms. So I guess at some level, I do understand it. As I mentioned earlier, I'm primarily known as a language researcher, and that's the area in which I received my doctoral training. I've applied that training to the study of language and autism in a few ways. For example, and perhaps one of the most replicated autism findings I've published, my colleagues and I demonstrated that infant and toddler oral and manual, meaning hand, motor skills, such as blowing raspberries and reaching into a 1-year birthday cake, predicted which autistic children would later develop speech fluency. In another article, I demonstrated that autistic toddlers are no less likely than non-autistic toddlers to use mentalizing language, when the autistic and non-autistic toddlers were equated for their non-mentalizing language skills. A similar message ran through my article, Fast Mapping is a Laboratory Task, Not a Cognitive or Social Cognitive Capacity. And a similar message was heralded in Sarah Prepus-Capit's in my article, Who's Missing the Point? A commentary on claims that autistic persons have a specific deficit in figurative language comprehension. Sarah Prepus-Capit, by the way, is a best-selling novelist whose kidlit books feature autistic girl protagonists, including a knuckleball-throwing Little League pitcher, and I highly recommend her books. When 2 neurodivergent co-authors, Emily Morrison and Emmy Grace, with them, we summarized these and other findings in a chapter published in the Neurobiology of Language and in an article published in the Annual Review of Linguistics. From echolalia and pronoun reversal to quote, theory of mind narratives, we show that language can develop atypically, but not necessarily aberrantly. I've also used my training in language to challenge the use of language about autistic people. For example, in the use of person first language in scholarly writing may accentuate stigma, I analyzed the texts of more than 5 million books, 25 million abstracts, and 150 million scholarly articles to demonstrate that scholarly writing uses person first language more often for children with than without disabilities, more often for children with disabilities than adults with disabilities, and most often for the children with the most stigmatized disabilities. For example, the scholarly literature is much more likely to use the term gifted children with autism than the term autistic children with giftedness. In special needs is an ineffective euphemism. We demonstrated that children and adults described as having special needs, rather than described as having a disability or having a specific disability, such as autism or ADHD, were rated significantly less positively. Therefore, the euphemism was actually working as a dysphemism. In More Shared Responsibility for More Appropriate Communication, which was published in Asho's Perspectives, I examined 100 scholarly articles to demonstrate that researchers, parents, and clinicians frequently place the burden of, quote, more appropriate communication, unquote, on disabled children rather than sharing the responsibility. In other words, researchers, clinicians, and some parents often forget that reciprocity is a two-way street, and therefore the responsibility for more appropriate communication must be shared. That's the general nature of communication. In another article, my collaborators and I answered the question, do puzzle pieces and autism puzzle piece logos evoke negative associations? And the answer we empirically found is yes. We concluded that if an organization's intention is to evoke positive associations to autism, then the organization probably should avoid using puzzle piece imagery. In infantilizing autism, we analyzed autism societies and autism charities' definitions of autism to demonstrate that they frequently refer to only autistic children at the expense of ignoring or infantilizing autistic adults. In this forum about mirror neurons, which you might remember they were very hot about 15 years ago, I reviewed scores of studies to conclude that the evidence that autistic people lack or have broken mirror neurons is simply not viable. And more recently, Melanie Yergo and I conducted an exhaustive analysis of the claim that autistic people lack a theory of mind. And we concluded that the claim is empirically questionable and societally harmful. With autistic collaborator Sebastian Dern, we found that specificity, context, and reference groups matter when assessing autistic traits. For example, when responding to the item, I enjoy being around people, autistic people are much more likely to report that they enjoy being around people if the people are specified as autistic people, whereas non-autistic people respond in the exact opposite way. We also empirically demonstrated that autistic people are just as motivated to enhance themselves, that is, engage in self-enhancement by telling positive things about themselves, a bit like I'm doing today, and that autistic people are just as likely to do so as non-autistic people are. All of which can be summarized, I believe, by remembering the importance of accepting diverse brains and being aware of the stigma that can arise from psychological science. I believe a good way to attenuate that stigma is to address group differences as differences, not necessarily deficits. I also believe that that's a responsibility that should be shared equally with non-autistic parents and researchers and should not have to be carried solely by autistic people. After all, reciprocity is a two-way street. Thank you so much for your attention to my presentation. Thank you again for inviting me here today. And at this point, I would welcome questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gernsbacher. I have read many of your studies, and I wanted to say as well that we actually created a language guide to help both researchers and people in the community. And we cited multiple articles that you mentioned that you had written, because it seems that there are a lot of practices that are very outdated that well-meaning people, aren't aware of. And some people have been trained specifically, like for instance, in using person-first language or special needs, people have been, specifically trained to do so. Do you get the sense that any universities are adopting this new language and changing the language that they're teaching future professionals?
Absolutely. And Jen, I absolutely agree with you that in many of these language denotations, the origins were positive. They were to reduce the stigma and to
Yeah.
protect people with disabilities and children with disabilities. And so I talk about that in the person first language, that the origin was in a positive way. And then what happened with person first language was that it was never applied the way it should have been applied. The notion is that all people are people, and that so that all people should be referred to as people first. I mean, that's the person first language. But what happened was that only people with disabilities got referred to as people first. And as my research documented, it wasn't just only people with disabilities, it was most likely children with disabilities. And it was not just most likely children with all disabilities, but children with the most stigmatized disabilities.
Right.
The example of the giftedness. So we're fine with saying giftedness rather than child with, we're fine with saying gifted child rather than child with giftedness. Or what I see in the literature all the time is that we see, we studied 54 children with autism and 54 typically developing children. So
Yeah.
we're fine with using identity first language for non-disabled children or adults.
Yeah.
And that's what led to the stigmatization, is that it's as others have written much more eloquently than I, but it's only when the individual, be it the child or the adult, has a stigmatizing disability that we say, oh, we have to do this weird thing and call what I argued even more attention to the
Yes.
child and the disability by doing that. We're fine with doing it for giftedness. We're fine with doing it for just a whole range of, achieving a whole range of positive descriptors, including typically developing. Rarely, and I research documented, rarely do we see child with typical developments. That we study 54 children with autism, 54 children with
Right.
typical development. And so to argue that it's more sensitive or it's more supportive to use person first language, that argument kind of falls hollow when we look at our actual language use, which was the purpose of my article.
Yeah.
Then in answer to your question about, let me just back up and say, and special needs as well. Special needs was created as a way to kind of soften the blow, to say, well, we're uncomfortable with this word disability, so we're going to we're going to say everyone's special and these individuals. But as you know, disabled people have been telling us for years, as soon as, in fact, that euphemism began, my needs are not special. I have human needs.
Right.
I have the same needs as everyone else. And when you start calling them special needs, then that means that first of all, they might not be human. And secondly, that you're going to have to go above and beyond
Yeah.
to meet my needs. It glorifies my needs. And so they've been telling us, just say the word. I mean, there's a wonderful um, uh, Twitter movement that says, say the word, say the D word, that disability is not a negative word, that we should embrace it and use it. But it is true, as you mentioned, that the origin of special needs was indeed to soften the blow. Now, in answer to your question, do I see training in university? I've definitely seen much more movement with regard to identity first versus person first language. I'm seeing it sounds very self-serving, but every time my article about person first language gets cited, I go and look, and people are saying, yeah, we were taught to do X, but now we realize that we really should be doing Y, or we should be. I mean, the reality is you should ask people how they want to
Mhm.
be referred.
Right,
That
right,
we should not, as make assumptions about how other people. And there are people with disabilities and people with autism. I'll use the person first language, who like person first language, and
right.
that's wonderful. We should ask people that we should, even in the old like 1990s APA style guide, it said refer to people how they want to be referred. And that's really the issue, is that they get to decide rather than we, in this benevolent and kind of patriarchal way,
Mhm.
decide how they are going to be referred. In terms of special needs, I'm seeing slightly more change. I definitely think the person first and identity first distinction is getting picked up a bit more in terms of scholarly and in terms of training. And I think it's also hard, if we've always been taught that X is more positive than Y, it's hard to retool ourselves. So
Yeah.
I completely appreciate that.
Yeah. And another thing that I recently started thinking of, thanks to communication first, actually, is aside from special needs, having all of the issues that you mentioned, disability is actually protected by law.
Right.
So special needs are not.
Exactly.
And so, even for that reason, people are entitled to certain accommodations, and, you know, there are laws in place to protect them. We could argue that there aren't enough, but, um, you know, so I kind of try to encourage people in that sense as well, even especially if you're talking to like your school district or, something like that. And like you said, when you say special needs, it implies that people are doing extra, and we're not talking about extra, we're talking about the minimum requirement to level the playing field that everyone else has.
Exactly. Yeah.
um
And I was going to say, that's what also in our research that we found when we asked people to free associate to special needs, their free associations were about going above and beyond and having to do all this work, rather than this is the legal level. This is the legal
yeah,
basic for getting to literally the table.
yes, exactly. I just wanted to tell you a comment from a parent here. Holly Ray says, I just wanted to thank you for this presentation. I'm a mother of an amazing 4-year-old autistic boy. In my research to help him, I'm finding that I myself am most likely autistic as well. It's so refreshing to hear about autism spoken about in this light. So, do you want to, what's your advice to parents of newly diagnosed children? Because we are bombarded by stigmatizing information. Um,
I I totally agree, and I'm not a clinician, so I cannot. I really try to be cautious about giving any clinical advice and the like. But I can just say, from parent to parent, that it is very discouraging to read even what well-meaning, even what your pediatrician might hand
yeah.
you.
Yes.
And it's just incredibly, and even a well-meaning, adored pediatrician, it's incredibly discouraging. And what that, again, not clinical advice, I really want to take a step back, but I think listening to autistic people is the most important and valuable thing that any of us can do parents, community members, professionals, researchers, the whole 9 yards, listening to autistic people because they have the lived experience and because they have so much to share with us. And in the early days, it was just a few books here and there, and people, you know, were so hungry. Then, there's blogs, and now there's just a wealth of material. And I'm so delighted to see that autistic people, as Jen and I were discussing before we went live, that autistic people are writing journal articles to clarify. And I've been so fortunate to work with um, Melanie Yergo and Sebastian, I mean, the whole list of autistic people. And they're actually in the scientific and scholarly journals. And I think that will help us so much beyond just being handed things by very well-meaning neighbors or
Yeah.
pediatricians or teachers, because we'll get that feel. And I don't think I don't think that suggestion or that advice is atypical from anything else. I mean, any other time, any other job. I mean, when we decide to become parents, we want to talk to other parents. When we decide to take a job in a particular part of the country, we want to talk to other people who have taken a job in that particular part of the country. I mean, that's the whole purpose of Yelp reviews and Amazon reviews and everything else. Is we don't want to listen to the manufacturers. We want to find out who did use, as my most recent purchase, a successful leaf vacuum, because I'm here in the Midwest and we're about to have, leaves aplenty. I'm interested in what the manufacturer has to say, but what I really want to find out is who's bought this device, who's used it successfully, and what are their comments and suggestions and concerns. And I think we should be doing the same thing with all disabilities and with all other atypicalities, gender and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the disability community says nothing about us without us. And it's so true because, you know, there really shouldn't be anything done without the people that this is all designed for. I mean, they are the most important stakeholders in all of this.
Well,
Um,
as I mentioned in my AP, when I was president of APS, and I used that bully pulpit to write some presidential columns, and one of the ones about bias in research, I went back to the 1920s to look at how men were writing about women, because at that time women were not researchers, they were not behavioral science researchers. I mean, it took a long time for the first PhD and someone to have a job just like mine. And so men were saying these, really, like, if women recalled more words in a memory task than men did, then it was described as a deficit. It was because they were hyperverbal and they were
right.
hysterical. If they I mean, really, the literature, it's kind of terrifying to go back to the 1920s. And of course, let's talk about the horrific and horrendous literature and the role that psychology has played in racism. And you could go back to the 1940s and 50s and read how white psychologists were describing people of color. My sense is that down the line, we will see, as more autistic people are involved in research, we will see that shift happen. But it probably will take some time.
Yeah. And then, the problem is then, research, uh, the how can I say this? The landscape and research starts to evolve, but then it still takes so long for the service sector to evolve.
Mhm.
I mean, I know I personally feel it moves at a snail's pace. Um,
Yeah, could be really, yeah.
so do you feel
Well,
that?
well, I was going to say another way that we can approach this, and I think one of the ways that we do see some differences happening is kind of back to the thesis in my presentation, which is this call for reciprocity. And I think um, when I again back to this wonderful, lovely, and for which I'm very grateful comment. Um, that the literature is so offensive and so horrible.
Yes. Yes.
And I want to say, how would you like to be described this way? How would you like your child or your loved one or your significant other or your parent to be
Mhm.
described this way? And that's one of the things that I've tried to do is say, let's have a little reciprocity. Let's have a little quote perspective taking. And if you would write this, would you write this about your own child? Would you write this about a neighbor, etc.? And I think that might be a way also to kind of move things forward. And I think that's where the service sector has been a little bit farther ahead, is because there are very many, there's some amazingly wonderful and empathic service providers. That's not to say there aren't empathic researchers. I just think that with researchers, no one, or at least very few people, have kind of called them to this task of, would you write this about your own child or
Right.
a group that your child is a member of? Would you write this about a group that your significant other is a member of? Well, no, I would write it in a different way. I would describe it different. Then that's what we need to be doing. Um,
Yeah.
thank you
Yeah.
again for that lovely comment, and best wishes to you and your sounds like amazing 4-year old.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think these the shifts in the language do make such a drastic difference in shifting how you think in general about a person with a disability. I like for many of us, you know, for parents, like having an autistic child may be the first time that they've even interacted with someone with a disability. And so, like, I remember for myself, I had no very, very little past experience with disability, which may partly be due to how we used to segregate even more so than we do today. Um, but starting to see these um, people calling these things out and drawing attention to, the stark contrast in, say, how an autistic person is described versus a typical person. It's very jarring. It kind of Rudy Riggin had been on last year, and I just love her. And like she had even said how once you start realizing these things, it changes a lot of your relationships
Mhm.
because it hurts to hear other people talking in that way. And when you realize the damage that it actually
Mhm.
does to another person, but it's also, even for a parent, it's marginalizing the parent in many ways as well. um, and there's a really great book, by the way, that I just want to mention quickly because she's going to be on a later webinar with us. But um, it's called Constructing the Mother by Priya Lalvani. And it's about how these, marginalizations for anyone in a minority group really affect people, can cause trauma. And so I just want to say to you as well, Dr. Gernsbacher, that I am so grateful for your work because it's like in this sea of negativity to find those people that are humanizing your child and changing the outlook of how we can move things forward to make it more equal for people it's a way of empowering people.
Thank you.
um so
Thank
I'll
you
just
so much.
work on
My
different
sense is also that, even as I look back at the work that I might have written, even 10 years ago, I've grown since then, and I hope that the community will also, appreciate that. Yes, that we've moved even beyond that. So I think that and in that movement in that direction will be incredibly, incredibly important. So,
yeah.
but I also wanted to resonate with what you said with regard to many of us might not have had exposure or experience with disability before we had a family member with a disability. And I'm old enough that I graduated high school before IDEA. And so I literally didn't see other students
Yeah.
with disabilities. And then I taught high school. That was my first career, and that was after IDEA. But those students were so far away from the rest of the students. I mean, they were literally in a trailer, at the on the other side of the football field. I mean, it
Yeah.
was literally that case. But as we know, I mean, the reality is that a large segment of our population are disabled. All of us, if we live long enough,
Yes.
will be disabled. And embracing and getting familiar with the disability world and with the need for accommodations. I mean, you mentioned my courses, so I'll take a moment to riff a little bit
Yeah.
about that, which is that I'm just a real strong believer in universal design. And what universal design says is that just like in universal design in architecture, universal design in instruction says, we're not going to build a building and come back later and put in a ramp and come back later and put in the elevator. We are going to build those things into the building from the very beginning. And it's challenging, and I am far from perfect at it, that's for sure. But the notion is designing courses so that accommodations don't have to be on request, that they are already built
Right.
in. And those accommodations are things such as captions, as you mentioned with the videos. There are things such as making sure all the PDFs are screen readable. They are things such as flexibility in deadlines. They are things such as making sure that we are not measuring anxiety when we're measuring learning, so that we are not relying on time testing, that we're not relying on creating environments that are so stressful in terms of group work
Mhm.
and things like that, that just don't. That we're not assessing learning and we're not encouraging learning. And so I'm just a huge, huge proponent of universal design in instruction. And I know I also have a lot more to learn about it. And I'm so eager to hear back from my students when they tell me that the course worked for them, or that this could be changed and that would work for them even better. Because what we know at the university level is that, and as we saw with the college entrance scandal, that the more affluent the family, the whiter the family, the more likely they are to have university level accommodations. And we see that all over. In fact, one of the interesting data points is that there are more students registered with disability services at private liberal arts colleges than there are at two-year community colleges. And one would think it would be exactly, I
Wow.
see the shock on your face. One would think it would be just the opposite. And it's because it's so tightly yoked with access to accommodations in higher ed, is so tightly yoked with affluence
Mm.
and and race and ethnicity. And given that, that suggests, that to me is a wake up call, that rather than having accommodations on request, that accommodations should be baked in to the
Yeah.
courses.
Yeah. Wow. That is just another way, I guess, that bias affects the whole system. Um, okay, so I wanted to ask you. So I have a couple things. Um, I mentioned that we had Rudy Riggin, um, and um, in past presentations, like one of the things she's said is that silence is not absence, and just because someone isn't responding, like we shouldn't make the assumption that they. Well, first of all, we shouldn't make the assumption that they don't have something to say, but also they have a perspective whether or not they can or do respond to us. Um,
Mhm.
and a lot of times that absolutely gets lost in interactions. I know I can't think of who did the research, but I know there was somewhat recent research showing that neurotypical people make snap judgments about autistic people in like the first couple seconds. Um, People are constantly underestimated if they don't communicate in a so-called, typical way. Um, so given all of that, is there anything you want to say on that? And then I
Sure.
also I wanted to ask you one other thing after that, but you can.
Sure. Sure.
elaborate on that, please?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. Like, not so much with regard to the response time, but with regard to eye contact. That, one of my favorite lines from years ago when autistic perspectives were only available in books was by a book that I'm now going to block on the title, but I'll remember it later. Um, actually, there's two favorite lines. One was when is an obsession not an obsession, and this is an autistic teenager. And then it was when it's American football. And so, yeah, and we can
Yes.
also kind of go through when it's like, makeup TikToks, or we could just go
Yeah.
through a whole list of these. I just thought it was so so apropos. But another quote from that book that I really enjoyed, which was that you can either have my eye contact or you can have my cognition and my attention. You choose which one you want. Do you want my eye contact to make you feel better, or do you want my cognition and my attention? Because, those two things trade off. And the reality is they do, even for non-autistic people. And so, Shannon,
Yes.
I'm going to put you on the spot. But if I asked you, what did you have for breakfast this morning?
Bacon.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask you, what did you have for breakfast February 3rd, 2014?
No idea.
And usually people like look away. Or if I say, what's the highest? Okay. So I'll say, who's president right now?
Biden.
Okay. What's the tallest mountain in South America?
I have no idea.
You did it though, but I got you to do it, which is you looked away, you averted
Mm,
your eyes. And we know that. We've known that for 40 years,
yeah.
that even for non-autistic people, that eye contact is attentionally demanding. And when you
Yeah.
ask people hard questions, they avert their eyes. When you ask them, because, and that shows you, it's like patting your head and rubbing patting your head
Yes.
and rubbing your stomach, or rubbing what direction that is. That it's if something draws on the same attentional system, then it's really hard to do both things at the same time. And answering tough questions shows that even for non-autistic people, eye contact really is demanding. And
Mhm.
so when autistic people tell us, you can either have my eye contact or you can have my attention and cognition, but you can't have both, they are absolutely right. That's what not just the literature on autistic people, but non-autistic people tell us, which is it is demanding. And then when you ask non-autistic people tough questions, I asked you just cognitively tough, but if I asked you emotionally tough questions, we avert our eyes. We avert
Yeah.
our eyes because we need to get that energy. We need to plug in and get some energy to answer that question. So I think so many of the aspects, and I think Rudy is so wise on so many issues, and with regard to pauses and silence, and the
Yes.
whole notion that we have to have this rapid fire back and forth, and also just the cultural assumptions. I mean, that's why I loved working with Namira Akhtar and with her coming from a Muslim background, which is this whole mom child interaction, that's the face to face, that's the normative, that's the
Right.
prototypic, is so wrong. Because go around the world and you'll see that is very upper middle class Western. It is not universal. And I think, if I had another part of my career, I mean, another 20 years or more, those are some of the questions that I would really, really love to answer, because I think that even our conceptions about autism and autistic people are so embedded
Mhm.
in an upper middle class Western approach. And of course, as we now know, a boy, in terms of
Yeah.
diagnosis, a boy and men gendered approach. And I think that that is going to be really where the exciting work is done, which is broadening our conceptions and making sure that we're not missing people because we've had this very narrow perspective about it.
Yeah, definitely. So the other question I had really wanted to ask you about, and I'm so interested to hear what you think, is what do you think about social skills group? Or social skills,
Yeah,
great.
I'm gonna punt that one, Jen, because
Oh
it's
boy.
probably a little too complex here. So I just want to punt
Okay.
it. Yeah, I know that other people have, and some of your other guests have have discussed it, but I'm gonna punt that one.
Okay.
I will just say, in general, I think in terms of interventions, that um, we need to have the people being intervened on at
Mhm.
the table when we design an intervention. We just have to. And, I think that's the bottom line. But I'm going to punt that about social skills. So sorry. And
No,
I know
that's
we're coming up on the hour anyway. So I'm fine with wrapping up whenever you are.
okay. I guess then on that note what are your, I guess, final words of wisdom to leave us with?
Sure, sure. Well, first of all, thank you again for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you for arranging this series, which has had some extraordinarily interesting people, and I'm giving them a platform. And I probably will just come back to that core message of reciprocity and perspective taking. And I know in my original 2006 7 article, I give lots of examples about in parenting and in teaching and the like. And parenting examples of one of my favorites is, a mom who camped out on the streets of her hometown with her autistic 10-year-old son, so that they could be the first ones to turn on the hot and fresh light at now I'm blocking on the donut. Krispy
Krispy
Kreme.
Kreme?
Yeah, Krispy Kreme donut. And things like that. And it's like, I think that there's this notion of being reciprocal is kind of, quote, I believe the right thing to do because that's what reciprocal is. But I think there's also, that's how those are the fun things to do, like,
Yeah.
designing. And I, in my paper, I juxtapose that with a mom who wants to take her daughter on the Philly downtown trolley that's loud and rings the bell and people are all around because that's something she liked when she
Mhm.
was a child. And there's this notion of, um, that opens your world to say, this might not be what I like. I mean, it's
Yeah,
the same as even in romantic relationships. This might not be what floats my boat, but I know this is what floats this person's boat. And
right.
when in doing so, sometimes the world opens up and you get a lot more of these experiences that you never would have had otherwise, because you're still in this mode of what floats your own boat. So I'll leave on that positive note.
Absolutely. I love that so much. And I think that's really what this is all about is like increasing our understanding of what like joy and acceptance and being human is. Like you said, everyone is human and there's such a diverse way of being. And if we can be open to that, it just can highlight so many great things. Um,
Wonderful.
I'm going to put your website in the chat. We also did share it in the Facebook event and our email that went out today. Um, and you can find Dr. Gernsbacher's research on her website. It's, I believe, under the research. Yep, it's all under the research tab. Um, she has wonderful work. I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
I hope that we can all continue moving forward with this different view on things
Great.
you've been working toward for so long. And thank you so much again for all of the amazing work that you do.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.